The order arrived just before dawn, carried by a man who didn't knock. That detail mattered more than it should have. In Tokyo, especially near the ministries, knocking was not just manners. It was a rule, a signal that the world still made sense. Clerks knocked, messengers knocked, even men delivering bad news knocked first. But this man walked in like the door was never meant to stop him. He wore a dark coat, perfectly pressed, with no insignia and no visible rank. No one stopped him. No one asked his name. He placed a single document on the desk, bowed once, not deeply, not respectfully, just enough, and turned away. By the time anyone thought to speak, he was already gone. By sunrise, the government was finished. The paper itself looked harmless, almost boring. No dramatic language, no accusations, no speeches about duty or failure. Just a short imperial rescript, written in the calm, formal style used only for things that could not be undone. The entire cabinet was dismissed, effective immediately. No debate, no appeal. Men who had shaped policy, commanded budgets, and whispered orders behind closed doors were suddenly private citizens again. Offices were sealed within hours. Guards were reassigned without explanation. Phones stopped ringing. Files vanished into locked rooms. And no one asked why. Because the document carried the one thing that ended all questions: the Emperor's signature. In Imperial Japan, that signature was not just ink on paper. It was sacred. It was bloodline and myth, tradition and destiny pressed into a single name. The Emperor didn't argue. He didn't explain. His will didn't need to be understood, only obeyed. To question that signature was to question the nation itself. So people bowed, accepted the order, and moved aside as if history had simply chosen a new direction. What followed was not chaos, but silence. Former ministers packed their desks under watchful eyes, careful not to say too much. Some looked shocked. Others looked resigned, as if they had known this day would come sooner or later. No charges were read. No reasons given. The order did not accuse anyone of failure. It simply erased them. Outside, Tokyo went on as usual. Trams ran on time. Shops opened their shutters. Newspapers printed careful headlines that said almost nothing. The country absorbed the shock without a sound. Only one man hesitated. He was not powerful, not famous, just a low-ranking investigator whose job was to examine documents after decisions had already been made. He checked dates, seals, handwriting, the dull mechanics of authority that most people trusted blindly. When the rescript reached his desk, he felt a quiet unease he couldn't explain. Everything looked correct. The paper was right. The calligraphy was flawless. The signature matched known examples perfectly. And yet, the speed of it all felt wrong. An entire government ended overnight, and no one could point to who would replace it. The Emperor remained silent, distant, untouched. No public appearance followed. No clarification came from the palace. Power had moved, but no one could see where it had gone. The investigator looked again at the document lying calmly in its folder. It had already done its work. Careers destroyed. Authority reshaped. All without noise, without resistance, without a single argument. That was the most frightening part. In a system built on obedience and ritual, power didn't need force. It only needed the right symbols, delivered at the right moment. And as the city woke to another ordinary morning, one quiet truth settled in the investigator's mind. This order had not ended everything. It had proven how easily everything could end. The files were supposed to be there. That was the first rule of government work in Tokyo. Nothing ever truly disappeared. Papers multiplied, copies slept in basements, Side offices, forgotten cabinets. Even scandals left a paper trail if you knew where to look. So when the investigator requested the minister's personnel file, he expected something thick, boring, and slow to read. Education records, early appointments, family background. The kind of history that explained how a man climbed so high. Instead, he was handed an empty folder. At first, he thought it was a mistake. Clerks made mistakes all the time, especially after a shock like the cabinet's dismissal. He thanked the assistant politely, waited for her to leave, and checked again. Nothing. No forms. No handwritten notes. Not even a placeholder sheet. Just clean paper and the faint smell of dust, as if the folder had been opened and closed 1,000 times without ever being used. He went to the Central Archive next. The archive was a place that believed in permanence. Rows of shelves, locked rooms, careful silence. Records from wars, disasters, assassinations, all neatly labeled and preserved. If a man had ever existed in government service, his shadow would be here. The investigator gave the name, the title, the dates. The archivist nodded, disappeared behind the shelves, and returned several minutes later with the same empty look. "There's nothing," the archivist said. Not confused, not apologetic, just factual. The investigator asked again, using different spellings, older classifications, indirect references. He checked university records, military lists, tax registries, household registrations. Each search ended the same way. Clean gaps, perfect absences. It was as if someone had taken a ruler and erased the man's past without leaving a mark. That was when the pattern began to form. The deletions weren't sloppy. They weren't rushed. Files were missing not from one place, but from many. Ministries, archives, local offices, all cleaned in the same careful way. Dates aligned. Index numbers skipped neatly over his name. This wasn't damage caused by fire or chaos. This was design. Someone had known exactly where the records were stored and how to remove them without raising alarms. The investigator felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold rooms of the archive. To erase a man, this completely required authority, access, and time. It required people who could enter any office, open any drawer, and be obeyed without explanation. People who didn't leave signatures. He reported his findings to a superior, choosing his words carefully. The response came quickly and quietly. "Stop looking." The matter had already been resolved. Further inquiry was unnecessary. That answer told him everything. The absence of records was not a failure of the system. It was proof that the system had worked exactly as intended. Someone had decided that this minister didn't need a past. Not officially. Not on paper. His authority didn't come from education, service, or lineage. It came from somewhere else. Somewhere that did not want to be recorded. As the investigator closed the empty folder, he realized something deeply unsettling. In Imperial Japan, power did not always rise through visible paths. Sometimes it arrived fully formed, backed by silence, protected by erasure. A man without a past could still rule, as long as the right doors opened for him. And judging by the empty shelves and missing files, someone very powerful had opened every door at once. People remembered him. That was the problem. When the investigator began calling in witnesses, he expected resistance. Fear was normal. Silence was common. What he didn't expect was confusion, so carefully controlled, it felt rehearsed. Clerks, aides, junior officials, people who had worked in the same buildings as the minister, all reacted the same way when shown his photograph. Their eyes flickered. A pause. A polite smile. "Yes," they said. "I recognize him." And then, almost immediately, "But I've never spoken to him." The answers came too smoothly, one after another. Different people, different offices, same rhythm. They remembered his face. They remembered seeing him in corridors, at meetings, entering rooms that were not meant for them. But no one remembered a conversation. No one remembered instructions. No one remembered being introduced. It was as if the man existed only in passing, always present, never personal. The investigator pressed harder. One assistant admitted she had prepared documents for the minister every week. She could describe his handwriting preferences, the way he disliked corrections in red ink, the exact time his tea was delivered. But when asked how she received instructions, she went quiet. After a long pause, she said she couldn't remember. Her hands trembled slightly as she bowed and asked to be excused. Another official swore he had attended meetings with the minister for months. He could recall the seating arrangement, the topics discussed, even the weather outside the windows. But when asked what the minister had said during those meetings, his face went blank. "He was there," the man insisted. "That's all I can say." Then the refusals began. A mid-level bureaucrat agreed to testify, only to withdraw his statement the next morning without explanation. A former aide failed to appear at a scheduled interview. By the end of the week, 2 names on the investigators' list were quietly marked unavailable. One had taken sudden leave, the other had resigned and could not be located. No threats were made, no warnings delivered. People simply stopped cooperating, as if an invisible line had been crossed. Late one evening, the investigator met an elderly clerk who had served through 3 administrations. The man agreed to speak only after the office lights were turned off and the doors locked. His voice was low, careful, as if the walls themselves might listen. "He wasn't meant to be known," the clerk said. "Not in the usual way." Before the investigator could ask more, the old man froze. Footsteps echoed in the hallway outside. A pause, then silence again. When the investigator looked back, the clerk was already standing, bowing repeatedly, apologizing for wasting time. The meeting was over. The pattern was clear now. Witnesses weren't lying. They were obeying something older and stronger than fear of punishment. They had been trained, quietly, indirectly, to forget, to recognize without acknowledging, to participate without understanding. The investigator wrote his notes late into the night, aware that each sentence might be the last one he ever finished. In the margins, he circled the same phrase again and again: presence without contact. This was not how ordinary officials operated. Ministers built networks. They argued, they persuaded, they left impressions. This man did none of that. He moved through the system like a shadow, cast by something else, something standing just out of view. By the time the investigator closed his notebook, one thought had settled heavily in his mind. The silence of the witnesses was not accidental. It was the result of careful design. And if people were vanishing from records and conversations alike, then this case was no longer about a single minister. It was about a system that had learned how to erase memory itself, while leaving obedience perfectly intact. The first document appeared by accident. The investigator wasn't even looking for the minister anymore. After weeks of empty files and silent witnesses, he had learned that direct questions led nowhere. So he began searching sideways, through forgotten storage rooms and misfiled boxes, places where clerks sent papers that no one expected to be important. That was where he found it. A brittle sheet of paper, tucked inside a folder, labeled with a similar, but not identical, name. The face on the document stopped him cold. It was the same man, the same narrow eyes, The same sharp line of the mouth, the same calm expression that refused to reveal anything. But the date at the top of the page was wrong. Not off by a year or two, off by decades. According to the document, the man had served in a minor administrative role more than 30 years earlier. The photograph attached was faded, the edges cracked with age, but the resemblance was undeniable. Too precise to be coincidence. The investigator checked the listed age. It didn't match. The man in the old file should have been elderly by now, or dead. The current minister was neither. At first, the investigator considered the simplest explanation. Coincidence. Common face. Common name. Japan was full of both, but the more he compared the documents, the harder that theory became to defend. The handwriting in the margins matched modern samples. The formal language followed patterns no longer used by that time period, as if the document had been written later, but dated earlier on purpose. He searched deeper. More records surfaced, scattered across unrelated departments. Each one carried fragments of the same identity. Similar name, similar face, similar role, different decades, different offices. None of the timelines aligned. In one file, the man appeared to resign before he was appointed. In another, he was listed as present at meetings that took place after his supposed death. The past didn't just contradict the present, it refused to behave like time at all. The investigator laid the documents side by side on his desk, forming a crooked timeline that made no sense. This was not the life of a man rising through the ranks. It was something else, a series of insertions, carefully placed, each one just convincing enough to pass inspection, each one isolated enough to avoid comparison. Someone hadn't erased the past completely. They had rewritten it, selectively. The idea unsettled him more than the empty files ever had. Erasure was blunt. Rewriting required intention. It meant someone understood how historians thought, how archivists categorized, how investigators searched. They didn't need the past to be true. They only needed it to be plausible. Late that night, the investigator visited a retired records officer who owed him a favor. The old man studied the documents in silence, then shook his head slowly. "These are not mistakes," he said. "They are placeholders." The word lingered. A placeholder did not represent reality. It occupied space. It prevented questions. It told the system that something had always been there, even if it hadn't. The investigator felt a quiet horror settle in. If a man could be inserted into history like this, then history itself was not a record. It was a tool. By the time he returned to his office, dawn was breaking again. Another day, another illusion of normalcy. The minister still sat in his office. The emperor remained distant and silent, and somewhere between past and present, a manufactured life was holding together just long enough to serve its purpose. The investigator understood now. This was not a single forged identity. It was a method. The letter was hidden where no one would look for it. Not in the main file. Not in the official registry. Not even in the cabinet records where appointment papers usually lived. It was slipped between unrelated documents like a bookmark in a book you weren't supposed to open. One thin page, folded once, no signature, no seal at the top. The kind of paper that could be dismissed as a note if it didn't carry the weight of something far more powerful. The investigator unfolded it carefully. The writing was calm, polite, almost gentle. It didn't argue for the minister's appointment, or praise his abilities, or list his service. It simply stated that the appointment was appropriate and necessary for continuity. That phrase again. The word that kept appearing whenever decisions were made without explanation. The investigator read it twice, Then a third time. The more he read, the more unnatural it felt. Whoever wrote this wasn't persuading anyone. They were reminding the system of something it already understood. It wasn't a recommendation in the ordinary sense. It was permission. He checked for any official routing marks. There were none. No stamps, no dates, no indication of who had received it or filed it. And yet, the appointment had proceeded flawlessly, without hesitation, as if the letter had opened every locked door in advance. That was what frightened him. Not the missing signature. The certainty. Then he noticed the handwriting. It wasn't the thick, rushed style of ministry clerks. It was precise, controlled. The strokes were deliberate, measured, almost elegant, like someone trained to write carefully because their words mattered. The ink pressure was consistent. The rhythm of the sentences felt familiar, as if the writer had composed thousands of similar messages over a lifetime. The investigator had seen this style before. Not often. Only in older archived correspondence, connected to men who had shaped Japan's modern era without standing in the spotlight. Elder statesmen, advisors, the genro. He pulled those letters from storage, hands slightly unsteady. Private memos, notes exchanged between powerful figures who rarely signed anything publicly, but guided decisions all the same. When he placed the anonymous recommendation beside the genro letters, the similarities were impossible to ignore. Not identical. Whoever wrote this had been careful, but close enough to suggest lineage, a shared language, a shared mind. The investigator felt his throat tighten. If this letter truly came from that world, it meant the minister's appointment had not been political. It had been structural, the kind of decision made quietly at the top of the invisible system, where tradition replaced law and consensus replaced debate. The genro were not supposed to exist as an institution. They were not written into the Constitution. They did not have a formal office. And yet their influence, whispered through decades, still shaped the machinery of the state. This letter felt like proof that their hand hadn't vanished. It had simply learned to leave less evidence. The investigator brought the letter to a senior official he trusted, presenting it carefully, as if showing a blade rather than paper. The man glanced at it once, then looked away, refusing to study it closely. His face remained calm, but his eyes hardened. "Where did you get that?" he asked. The investigator answered. The official nodded slowly, then returned the letter as if it burned his fingers. "Put it back," he said, "and forget you saw it." No denial, no surprise, no curiosity. That was confirmation enough. Walking back to his office, the investigator understood the real function of unsigned power. A signature creates responsibility. It creates a target. But a letter like this, floating without a name, was untouchable. You couldn't accuse a person. You couldn't confront an institution. You were facing a tradition, an invisible authority that moved through language, through habit, through silent understanding. That night, the investigator stared at the minister's appointment once more, now seeing it differently. The past had been erased. The witnesses had been trained into silence. The identity had been rewritten. And behind it all, a simple letter had allowed the entire system to accept an impossible man without resistance. The most terrifying part wasn't that the letter existed. It was that it worked. At first, the investigator thought he was watching a careful politician. The minister rarely spoke in public. He avoided strong statements. He moved through the ministries like a man who understood the value of restraint. In most cases, that would have made him look disciplined, even wise. But after everything the investigator had uncovered, empty records, silent witnesses, the unsigned recommendation, restraint began to look less like personality and more like instruction. So he stopped reading files and started watching behavior. For 3 weeks, he tracked every meeting the minister attended. The schedules were official, but the real details lived in side notes and whispers, emergency councils, late-night briefings, closed-door discussions that weren't announced until after they ended. The investigator expected to find something. Arguments the minister won, policies he pushed, enemies he crushed quietly. Instead, he found something far stranger. The minister never decided anything. It wasn't obvious at first. His name still appeared on decisions. His office still issued approvals. But when the investigator looked at the order of events, he noticed a pattern that repeated so cleanly it felt mechanical. A crisis would begin. Departments would argue. Ministers would clash. Advisors would disagree. Everyone would act like the outcome was uncertain. Then the minister arrived. He would sit down calmly, listen without emotion, and say very little. Sometimes nothing at all. He didn't lead the room. He didn't fight for an idea. He didn't even appear to negotiate. He simply observed, like a judge who had already seen the verdict. And then, almost immediately after he left, the conflict would dissolve. A decision would be recorded as confirmed, not proposed, not debated, confirmed. The investigator pulled internal meeting notes from multiple offices, comparing them side by side. The same language kept appearing. After the minister's presence, agreement was reached. Presence, not instruction, not leadership. Presence. That word haunted him. It implied that something happened without anything being said. He interviewed a junior clerk who had attended dozens of these sessions. The clerk tried to remain polite, but the tension in his voice betrayed him. When asked what the minister contributed, he hesitated, then answered softly. He makes it final. That was all. Not because the minister brought new ideas, but because his existence seemed to signal that the argument was over. As if his arrival meant the real decision had already been made somewhere else, and the room was only catching up. People adjusted their tone around him. They used more formal language. They stopped disagreeing openly. Not out of fear, exactly. More like instinct, like people stepping aside for something heavy and immovable. The investigator noticed other details too. The minister never arrived first. He always came after discussions had already begun. He never stayed for the messy part. He left before anything personal could happen. He avoided contact like a shadow avoids light. And yet, he was always present at the most important moments. A defense budget revision, a diplomatic shift, a sudden dismissal of an official. The minister's schedule was a map of invisible power. He appeared where outcomes mattered most, and nowhere else. By the 4th week, the investigator had written a sentence he could no longer ignore. The minister is not a source of decisions. He is the final shape of them. He was the stamp at the bottom of a document that had already been written. The mask that made a hidden choice look official. That realization made everything else click into place. A man who never decides cannot be blamed. A man who only confirms cannot be challenged. If policies fail, he can claim he followed procedure. If they succeed, he can accept credit quietly. Either way, the real decision-makers remain untouched. The investigator leaned back in his chair and felt something cold settle in his stomach. He had been looking for a mastermind, a conspirator, a villain with fingerprints all over the case. Instead, he had found a vessel, a man whose purpose was to exist at the right moment, so that unseen power could move through him without leaving a trace. And once he understood that, A darker question replaced every other one. If the minister never decides, then who does? Every decision has a first moment, a private conversation, a suggestion, a quiet agreement that turns into an order. Even the most secret governments leave some kind of trail, because people are human and humans make mistakes. That's what the investigator believed, until he discovered the meeting that left no record at all. He heard about it from someone who shouldn't have known. A retired official, half forgotten by the system, mentioned it like it was nothing. Just a passing remark over tea. Before the rescript, the man said, there was a gathering. Then he stopped himself, eyes narrowing, as if he had said something dangerous by accident. When the investigator asked where the meeting took place, the old man shrugged and changed the subject. But the word stayed. Gathering. The investigator checked the official schedule for that day. Nothing. No session, no council, no late-night consultations. According to the records, the ministries had been quiet, routine, normal, the kind of day that didn't deserve a footnote. And yet, the cabinet had been dissolved less than 24 hours later. Something had happened, so he searched for movement instead of paper. First, he requested security access logs from the government complex. The duty officer hesitated, then provided a sanitized report. Everything looked clean. No unusual entries. No major late-night traffic. Just the normal flow of clerks and guards. But the investigator had learned to distrust clean reports. He asked for raw data, not summaries. Numbers, timestamps, door access codes. That's where the truth slipped out. Within a short window late at night, several senior officials entered through side entrances. Not the main doors, not the ceremonial entrances. The side routes used for maintenance and private transit. Their access cards registered normally, but their names were missing from the final report. The system recorded the doors opening. It simply refused to record who opened them. He cross-checked vehicle logs next. Government cars traveled short routes with no listed destination. No passengers named. No official purpose. Just mileage. Enough to show that people had moved. Not enough to prove where they went. The investigator felt the ground shifting beneath him. It wasn't that the meeting was hidden. It was that it was treated like something that didn't need to be documented. Like something everyone involved understood must remain outside history. He checked room reservations in the building. Nothing. Then he checked maintenance logs. A single note appeared. Cleaning requested after hours. No room number. No explanation. Just a request. He took it to the janitorial supervisor. The man stared at the paper, his face tightening, and said the request was above his level. He refused to say more. The deeper the investigator dug, the more careful the erasure became. Not just missing documents, but missing expectations. Calendar pages torn out, visitor lists overwritten, security footage recycled early. This wasn't panic, it was discipline. Whoever organized the meeting didn't just want secrecy, they wanted denial. They wanted a world where the meeting could not even be imagined. Then the investigator found the strangest part: timing. The meeting occurred days before the minister's appointment. Too early to be formal procedure, too late to be a coincidence. This was where the real decision had been made. Not in Parliament, not in a cabinet debate, not in any room the public could name. It was a convergence of power outside the official system, where agreement could be reached without witnesses, without minutes, without responsibility. A meeting like that doesn't happen unless it's necessary, and it doesn't vanish unless someone powerful needs it to. By the time he returned to his office, The investigator could feel it in the air. The building was the same, but the mood had shifted. Clerks moved faster. Conversations ended when he entered a room. Doors that once opened easily now required extra clearance. Not blocked, slowed, managed. The system wasn't stopping him, it was guiding him away. He sat alone under a dim lamp and stared at his notes. A cabinet dissolved, a minister with no past, a silent recommendation, a man who never decided. And now, a meeting that officially never happened, yet seemed to be the source of everything. The investigator understood the danger at last. This wasn't about forgery or politics. It was about a hidden mechanism of power so old and so efficient that it didn't need to exist on paper. Because the moment you write something down, it can be found. By the time the investigator reached the 8th week, the case had stopped feeling like a scandal and started feeling like a blueprint. At first, he had treated the minister as the center of the mystery, a man with no past, a name that shouldn't exist. But the deeper he went, the clearer it became that the minister wasn't the target. He was the cover. The system didn't protect him because he was valuable as a person. It protected him because he was useful as a shape. And once the investigator saw that, the truth turned colder. The minister wasn't a man in the way other men in power were men. He wasn't ambitious. He didn't build alliances. He didn't collect enemies or prove himself through battles in Parliament. He didn't struggle to rise. He simply appeared, fully formed, perfectly placed, and immediately accepted. That kind of entrance wasn't luck. It was engineering. The investigator began writing a new description in his notes. The minister is a vessel. A vessel doesn't choose where it goes. It carries what is poured into it. That explained everything about the man's behavior. The silence, the careful neutrality, the way he never took responsibility, yet somehow stood at the center of every outcome. He didn't lead with ideas because he wasn't meant to have any. Ideas belong to people. A vessel belongs to a function. And the function, in this case, was legitimacy. In Imperial Japan, legitimacy was more powerful than truth. The throne didn't need to explain itself. It needed to appear unbroken, sacred, continuous. That sacred authority flowed through symbols, signatures, seals, rituals, formal language. Whoever controlled those symbols could move the state without ever stepping into public view. And the minister was built to be one more symbol, a human stamp placed at the end of invisible decisions. That's why his past had been erased. A real past creates ties, family, debt, rivalries, old mistakes. It makes a man predictable, but also vulnerable. It gives enemies something to hold. It gives allies something to expect. A man with no past has no anchor. He cannot be threatened with exposure because there is nothing to expose. He cannot be pressured through loyalty because he belongs to nothing but his role. The investigator thought back to the witnesses, how they recognized the minister's face but couldn't recall his voice, how they said they had prepared documents for him but never met him. It hadn't sounded human at the time. Now it made perfect sense. People remembered his presence, not his personality, because the system didn't require him to be known personally. He was meant to be passed through, like a seal pressed onto paper. You don't form a relationship with a seal. You obey it. And then came the most unsettling, a shape reused whenever needed, a name designed to fit into the machine, carrying the same role across different eras. Not a person, a method. That method explained the sealed order too. A cabinet dissolved overnight with no explanation. Witnesses silenced without threats. archives cleaned without chaos, decisions confirmed without debate. Everything moved like a system that had practiced this for generations, refining the art of control until it looked like routine. The investigator felt something close to dread, not because he feared a single enemy, but because he realized there might not be anyone to confront. No mastermind to arrest, no villain to expose. Just a quiet circle of influence, a tradition of unseen authority that outlived any individual. If that was true, then the minister was only the most visible part of a much larger mechanism. A mechanism that didn't rely on cruelty or force. It relied on structure. On people obeying without needing to understand. On symbols carrying weight that no one dared lift. That night, the investigator stared at the minister's photograph again. Calm face, clean uniform, empty eyes, and for the first time, he didn't feel anger. He felt something worse. He felt certainty. This man had been chosen not because of who he was, but because of who he wasn't. No history, no personality, no attachment. A perfect container for someone else's will. And once you build a system like that, the investigator realized, you don't have to win power. You only have to pour it. The warning arrived the way power always arrived in this city. Quietly, politely, impossible to refuse. It wasn't a threat shouted in a hallway or a letter stamped with anger. It was a small change in the investigator's day that carried a message sharper than any blade. A request that normally took an hour stayed pending for 3 days. A clerk who usually greeted him with a smile looked down at the floor and pretended not to see him. At first, he told himself it was bureaucracy, paperwork delays, office politics. But the pattern was too smooth, too coordinated. It wasn't random trouble. It was controlled pressure, applied carefully. Then came the phone call. It was from an old contact he trusted, someone who worked high enough to see the shape of things, but low enough to still fear them. The voice on the line was calm, almost friendly, but every word felt measured. "We should talk," the man said. "Not here. No details, no explanation. Just a time and a place outside the city, where walls couldn't listen." They met near a quiet shrine, away from ministries and guards. The air smelled like pine and cold stone. For a moment, the world felt normal again. Then the contact looked at the investigator and said something that changed everything. "They know you're looking." The investigator didn't ask who they were. In Imperial Japan, the most dangerous names were the ones you never said out loud. He asked what would happen next. His contact exhaled slowly. "Nothing," he said. "If you stop." Then he paused. "And everything, if you don't." That was the cruel elegance of it. The system wasn't threatening to arrest him. It wasn't accusing him of treason. It wasn't even telling him he was wrong. It was offering him a choice, silence or erasure. Close the case, and his life would remain intact. Continue, and his life would slowly dissolve until he was nothing but a gap in the records, like the minister's missing past. The investigator returned to his office with the weight of that conversation in his chest. He looked at the files on his desk, empty folders, mismatched timelines, silent recommendations, witness lists with names crossed out. Everything he had uncovered was real enough to frighten him, but not solid enough to destroy the machine behind it. He could write a report, he could leak information, he could even speak publicly. But what would it change? The cabinet would still be gone. The minister would still remain. The emperor's signature would still be untouchable, and the people who truly moved power would stay invisible, safe behind ritual and tradition. Late that night, he noticed something even worse than delay. His own records were thinning. A memo he had filed was missing from the log. A request number skipped as if it had never existed. A note he remembered writing was no longer in his folder. The system hadn't started punishing him. It had started editing him. Not removing him all at once, but smoothing away his edges, reducing his presence, making him easier to forget. That was when he understood what the witnesses had felt. The fear wasn't loud. It was quiet. It came in the form of polite smiles and closed doors. In this world, you didn't get dragged into the street. You got reassigned, ignored, forgotten. Your name stayed on paper just long enough for the world to pretend you had always been insignificant. The investigator sat alone in the dim light of his office and faced the choice he had been avoiding. If he pushed forward, he might expose something true, but he would likely vanish before anyone could act on it. If he stopped, he would survive, but the truth would remain sealed inside the machine. He stared at the minister's photograph one more time, a face without a past, a vessel without history. And for the first time, the investigator felt the real power of the system. It didn't need to kill you. It only needed to remove your place in the story. In the end, the hardest question wasn't whether the truth mattered. It was whether he would still exist long enough to tell it. Time moved forward, like it always did, as if nothing had happened at all. The minister remained in his office, calm and unchanged, appearing in official photographs with the same quiet expression and the same careful posture, standing beside men who came and went like seasonal weather. The cabinet that had been erased stayed erased. New names filled new seats, new announcements were printed, and the machinery of the state continued to run smoothly, cleanly, without a visible scar. That was the most unsettling part. How quickly the empire adjusted, how effortlessly it absorbed the shock and turned it into routine. The investigator watched from a distance now, because distance was all the system allowed him. His requests no longer reached sensitive archives. His access no longer opened the doors that mattered. No one told him he was suspended. No one accused him of disloyalty. Nothing dramatic happened, because drama would leave evidence, and this system avoided evidence the way a shadow avoids direct sunlight. Instead, his world simply narrowed. Meetings he once attended were moved without notice. Files he once reviewed were reassigned for efficiency. Colleagues who once spoke freely began treating him like a stranger, polite but empty, as if they had been trained to forget his name while still recognizing his face. One morning, he searched for a report he had written early in the investigation, a careful summary of missing records and timeline inconsistencies, and discovered it wasn't in the registry anymore. The reference number remained, but the document behind it was gone, replaced by a blank placeholder sheet. He checked another report. Same result. Then another. It wasn't an accident. It was a process. The system wasn't silencing him with force. It was erasing him with precision, removing his work so cleanly that no one could even argue it had ever existed. He visited the personnel office under the pretense of routine paperwork and asked to review his own file. The clerk smiled and handed it over. It was thinner than it should have been. Whole assignments were missing. Recommendations had vanished. Early postings were summarized in vague sentences that could apply to anyone. His career still existed, technically, but it had been stripped of detail, reduced to something harmless and forgettable. He realized then that he had become the final piece of the case, the proof of how the mechanism worked. When the system couldn't control your questions, it controlled your presence. It didn't need to imprison you. It simply needed to make you irrelevant. Outside, the world went on. The minister continued to confirm decisions that had been made elsewhere. The emperor remained distant and untouched. The seals and signatures continued to move the nation like gears in a machine no one was allowed to see. And the investigator, once convinced that truth alone could shake power, understood the deeper rule of this empire. Legitimacy mattered more than reality, and stability mattered more than truth. His name would remain in some records, just enough for the empire to pretend nothing had happened. But the work he had done, the questions he had asked, the connections he had drawn, would dissolve into silence, as if it had never been written. In the end, the minister remained, not because he was powerful as a man, but because he was useful as a role, and the investigator disappeared, not because he was wrong, but because he had looked too closely at how power moved when it didn't want to be seen. And somewhere deep in the archives, behind clean shelves and locked doors, the empire stored its greatest weapon. Not violence, not fear, but the ability to erase a story before it could ever be told. The strangest part wasn't that the empire modernized so quickly. It was that it modernized without ever letting go of the old grip of silence. And the Shenro understood that better than anyone. Railways spread, factories rose, new laws were written, and newspapers started talking about elections and public debate. But behind all that progress, the real question stayed the same. Who gets to decide what Japan becomes? The Genro treated modernization like a controlled fire, useful, necessary, but dangerous if it spread too far. They weren't afraid of new technology or new institutions. They were afraid of instability, of the kind of chaos that could crack the state and expose the emperor to blame. So they guided reform the way an experienced hand guides a blade, carefully, with discipline, keeping the sharp edge while avoiding a slip that could cut too deep. They allowed Parliament to exist, but ensured it could never fully command the military. They borrowed Western ideas, but wrapped them in Japanese language so the changes felt like tradition instead of invasion. They built a modern army, but tied its loyalty to the throne, not to elected officials, creating a system where the emperor could remain sacred, while real authority flowed through channels that didn't require public approval. This balancing act wasn't just political strategy, it was survival. The Genro knew that moving too fast would create backlash from conservatives who feared the loss of identity, while moving too slow would invite domination by foreign powers who saw Japan as weak. So they pushed forward and pulled back at the same time, letting the country transform while convincing people it was still the same. That's why they were so careful about symbols, ceremonies, and sacred distance. The emperor was the anchor, the untouchable center that kept the nation emotionally stable, even while everything around him changed. When a reform was too controversial, it could be delayed quietly, softened, or presented as an imperial necessity rather than a political choice. And once it wore the mask of imperial legitimacy, opposition melted away. When factions clashed, military leaders demanding strength, party politicians demanding influence, bureaucrats fighting for control, the Genro stepped in like silent referees, forcing compromise without ever looking like they were forcing anything at all. And that was their true genius. They didn't win battles through speeches. They won them through timing, placement, and quiet authority that everyone recognized, but no one could officially challenge. Modernization, in their hands, became a weapon and a shield at the same time, strong enough to protect Japan from the West, controlled enough to prevent Japan from tearing itself apart. Yet the very method that made this possible also created a dangerous illusion, because it trained the nation to accept decisions without transparency, to obey outcomes without asking how they were formed, and to treat the appearance of order as more important than accountability. The Genro didn't abolish politics. They contained it, keeping conflict away from the emperor's sacred image, ensuring the throne remained untouched even when the country made hard choices. It worked for decades, and that success is what made it so frightening, because when a system becomes powerful through invisibility, it doesn't just shape policy. It shapes how people think, what they believe is normal, and what they stop questioning. By the time Japan stood as a modern empire, competing with Western powers and expanding its influence, the Genro had proven something that still feels unsettling today. A nation can modernize, build institutions, and speak the language of democracy, while real power remains concentrated in a quiet circle that governs through tradition, silence, and the careful control of what the public is allowed to see. It hit him in a moment that felt almost insulting in its simplicity. The flaw wasn't a mistake, it was bait. For weeks, the detective had treated the forged seal like a crack in the system, a tiny imperfection that proved something illegal had happened behind the emperor's name. But the more he replayed the sequence in his mind, the less the mistake behaved like an error, and the more it behaved like a message. The rescript had been delivered cleanly, at the perfect hour, by a messenger who didn't knock, in a building where everything had rules. The cabinet had dissolved overnight with no resistance, as if everyone already knew the outcome. The signature had been confirmed instantly by experts who didn't hesitate, while the seal had been just slightly off in a way that only someone trained, obsessive and careful would notice. A sloppy forgery would have been obvious to everyone. A perfect forgery would have been invisible. This was neither. It was calibrated. It was wrong in a quiet, elegant way, like a deliberate misstep in a ritual meant to see who flinches. That realization made his stomach tighten, because it meant he hadn't discovered the secret. He had been selected by it. The system had allowed him to find the discrepancy, and the system had watched what he would do next. Suddenly, all the strange reactions around him took on a sharper shape. The delays in access weren't random. They were pressure tests. The witnesses who recognized the minister but refused to speak weren't just afraid. They were measuring how far the detective would push. Even the empty archives felt less like panic and more like choreography, the kind of clean erasure done by people who had time, authority, and no need to rush. If the forged seal was intentional, it could only mean one thing. There were two audiences for this rescript. The public audience, who would obey any paper with the Emperor's signature, and the internal audience, the small circle of officials who understood how power truly moved, and who needed to be reminded that the circle still controlled the rules of reality. The floor was a signal to insiders. We can break the law and still remain legitimate. And it was also a trap for outsiders. If you try to correct what you found, you will learn what correction costs. The detective felt the room around him grow colder, even though nothing had changed. He imagined a hand placing that imperfect seal on purpose, not trembling, not careless, but precise, leaving a tiny fingerprint of doubt, then stepping back to see who would notice. And he had noticed. That was the terrifying part, because in a normal country, finding proof of forgery would give you power. Here it did the opposite. It proved the enemy was confident enough to be seen. It proved they didn't fear discovery, because discovery itself was part of the design. The detective stared at the rescript again, at the careful spacing, the sacred signature, the almost perfect seal, and he understood the true purpose of the document. It wasn't written to remove the cabinet. That was easy. It was written to reveal something deeper, that the Empire could manufacture imperial will like a tool, and that the only people who mattered were the ones who knew when to look away. The choice didn't arrive as a threat or a warning. It arrived as silence. After the realization settled in, no one contacted him. No superior called him in. No order came down telling him to stop. Instead, doors stayed open that should have closed. Files remained where they were. And no one asked what he planned to do next. That was the pressure, because now he understood what revealing the truth would actually mean. If he submitted a report proving the seal was forged, the legal machinery would be forced to respond. Committees would form, experts would argue, newspapers would whisper, and for the first time, the public would see something dangerous, that the Emperor's authority could be technically wrong. Even if the signature was real, even if the intent came from above, the idea that imperial will required correction would crack something sacred. It would introduce doubt where obedience had always lived. The detective imagined the headlines that would never be printed, the debates that would be shut down before they started, the quiet chaos that would follow behind closed doors. And then he imagined the alternative. If he classified the discrepancy as irrelevant, if he described the seal variation as ceremonial, historical, or within acceptable deviation, the system would remain intact. The cabinet would stay dissolved. The new balance of power would solidify. The throne would remain untouched, spotless, unquestioned. The law would bend, but the myth would survive. That was the real equation, and it had nothing to do with justice in the way he had once understood it. In Imperial Japan, legality existed to serve legitimacy, not the other way around. He thought of the men who had vanished after asking similar questions, not dramatically, not violently, but quietly, reassigned, retired early, erased from relevance. He thought of the Emperor, distant and untouchable, more symbol than ruler, yet still the center around which everything turned. Was protecting that symbol an act of loyalty or an act of cowardice? He realized no one was forcing his hand because the system didn't need to. It only needed him to understand the cost of being right. To correct the record would be to place truth above the throne, and that was something the Empire could not allow, not because it was weak, but because it was too carefully constructed. The detective felt the weight of the decision settle fully onto his shoulders. This wasn't about exposing a conspiracy anymore. It was about deciding which fiction the country needed to survive. And the most unsettling part was knowing that whichever path he chose, the system would continue without him, adjusting itself smoothly, quietly, as it always had. By the time the case was officially resolved, the detective understood how endings worked in Imperial Japan. They weren't announced, they were agreed upon. He submitted his findings in the most careful language he had ever used, choosing words that could survive inside the system without setting it on fire. He did not call the seal a forgery in the blunt way his instincts demanded. He described it as irregular, anomalous, inconsistent with standard impressions, and attached his evidence as quietly as possible, like slipping a knife back into a sleeve. The response came faster than expected, and colder than any rejection letter. A sealed envelope arrived with a short note stating that the rescript had been reviewed, validated, and properly executed, and that no further action was required. No discussion, no questions, no invitation to clarify. His report was not argued against, because arguments create two sides, and the Empire did not allow two sides to exist when the throne was involved. Within hours, the file number was reassigned to a closed matter. The supporting documents were moved to a restricted archive, and the ministry staff began speaking of the event as if it had never contained a mystery at all. The cabinet dismissal became a necessary transition. The forged seal became a non-issue. The signature became final. Even the word investigation vanished from conversations, replaced by softer terms like review and confirmation. The detective tried to access the documents again through proper channels and discovered that the trail now led nowhere. He could see references to his submission, but the pages themselves had been relocated beyond his clearance, and every request returned with the same polite refusal. Unavailable, unnecessary, already settled. In the hallways, colleagues offered him the kind of smiles people give after an illness, relieved that you're still standing, but careful not to mention what almost killed you. No one praised his work, and no one punished him openly. The system didn't reward truth, and it didn't need to punish curiosity with violence. It simply absorbed what it could use and buried what it couldn't, sealing away his conclusions like a contaminated object that must not be handled again. The minister continued to appear at the center of power, calm as ever, confirming decisions that arrived from invisible places, while the emperor remained distant and untouched, as if nothing unusual had occurred. Tokyo kept moving. Newspapers printed safe headlines. Citizens bowed to the same symbols, and the detective realized the case hadn't been solved in the way a detective story is supposed to end. It had been neutralized. The Empire had taken the sharp edge of the truth, wrapped it in procedure, and locked it behind doors that no one was meant to open. Officially, everything was legitimate. Unofficially, the truth had been sealed tighter than any archive, because the most dangerous thing in this country was not a forged document, but a real one that proved the system could lie and still be obeyed. When it was over, when the files were sealed and the conversations drifted back to safer subjects, the detective finally understood what the case had been teaching him all along. He walked through the city and saw it everywhere now, in the bowed heads, in the flags that fluttered without explanation, in the way people spoke about authority as if it were weather, something natural and unquestionable. The truth, he realized, was never meant to stand on its own here. Truth was a material, like ink or wax, something that could be pressed, reshaped, softened when needed. Legitimacy did not grow out of facts. Facts were trimmed and aligned to protect legitimacy. The order had not destroyed the cabinet because it was perfect, but because it was useful. The forged seal had not weakened imperial authority. It had revealed how resilient that authority truly was. It could survive error, contradiction, even quiet deception, as long as the appearance of sacred continuity remained intact. The detective thought back to the moment he first noticed the flaw. How proud he had felt, how certain that discovery would lead to correction. Now he understood that the system had been watching him from the start, not to stop him, but to measure him, to see whether he would cling to truth as an absolute or recognize it as something negotiable. He had passed the test not by exposing the lie, but by understanding when exposure would cause more damage than silence, and that realization unsettled him more than any threat ever could, because it meant the Empire did not rule through fear alone, but through shared agreement, an unspoken contract that said stability mattered more than accuracy, symbolism more than proof. As days passed, references to the dismissed cabinet faded from memory, replaced by new rituals, new faces, the same unbroken image of imperial permanence. The detective's name remained in the records, but stripped of significance, attached to routine work, harmless assignments, safe conclusions. He was not erased, he was diluted, and perhaps that was the final lesson. In Imperial Japan, power did not crush those who saw too much. It simply taught them how to look away. Standing beneath the shadow of the palace one evening, watching the lights glow behind walls no report could penetrate, the detective accepted the quiet truth he would carry alone, that the Empire did not survive because it was always right, but because it knew exactly how to decide which truths were allowed to exist.